The chandeliers of Callahan Plaza glittered like captured stars, throwing shards of light across marble floors and polished champagne glasses. Laughter rose in soft waves, expensive and hollow. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, holding a glass of sparkling water, my navy dress simple among a sea of sequins and designer silk. To anyone watching, I probably looked like the quiet sister who never quite fit in, the one who had traded ambition for obscurity. "Nora, darling, there you are!" Margot's voice sliced through the hum of conversation like crystal against steel. She glided toward me in a silver gown that shimmered like frost, the picture of power and privilege. "We were just telling Graham about your little consulting company," she said, her smile tight, her tone effortless cruelty. "Still helping small businesses stay small." The group around her chuckled politely. My mother, Vivian, touched Margot's arm, pride glowing in her eyes. "That's my eldest," she said to a guest nearby, voice dripping with admiration. "The one who built something real." She didn't look at me. I could almost hear the unspoken second line, not like the other one. My chest tightened, but my face remained composed. Years of their ridicule had trained me well. Rowe and Callahan strategies, I replied evenly. "We focus on strategic restructuring." Margot laughed softly, a sound like breaking glass. "Restructuring. Oh, how quaint. Well, everyone needs a hobby." The table erupted in laughter again. For a moment, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, calm, unreadable. The kind of silence that unnerved people who needed noise to feel powerful. I leaned closer, just enough for Margot to hear. "Funny," I said quietly, "restructuring is exactly what some companies desperately need." Her smirk faltered, barely perceptible. Across the room, Ethan caught my eye, one brief glance, steady understanding. He knew what I was thinking. Let them laugh. Tonight was just noise. The real conversation would begin soon, and when it did, they'd understand what quiet power really looked like. I lifted my glass slightly toward Margot, a toast she didn't deserve, and smiled. "To family," I said softly, "and the lessons we learn from them." Growing up in the Callahan family was like living in a glass house where every reflection was a comparison. Margot had always been the shining one, the girl with perfect posture, perfect grades, perfect timing. At every dinner, she sat at the center beside our father Charles, the heir, a parent to a legacy built on marble money and manipulation. I was the afterthought, the quiet daughter who asked too many questions and cared too much about the cost behind the shine. By the time I turned 28, I was already branded the family disappointment, the one who left the safety of Callahan and Hayes to find herself. In truth, I hadn't been looking for myself. I'd been looking for my conscience. The day I walked away from the company, I remember my mother's words like the click of her pearls against her wrist. "No one leaves this family name and keeps respect," she had said, her voice silk over ice. Margot had smirked beside her eyes gleaming. "She'll come back," she told our father. "They always do." But I didn't. I left with nothing but a laptop, a rented apartment, and a name no one trusted anymore. The Callahan name had weight, it could open doors or crush you beneath them. For a long time, I thought I'd made a mistake, until Ethan came along. He was my first client, a financial analyst turned silent partner, sharp-eyed and brutally honest. Together, we built Rowe and Callahan strategies from the ground up, one smart decision at a time, one sleepless night after another. He used to joke that my revenge was built in balance sheets and boardrooms. I told him it wasn't revenge. Not yet. 10 years passed. While Margot's face graced magazine covers, I stayed invisible. While Vivian hosted charity galas dripping in borrowed warmth. I worked quietly from behind screens that connected London, Singapore, and Zurich. Power doesn't always come from being seen. Sometimes it grows in silence, and in that silence, I watched everything. I saw Margot's arrogance tighten the company's debt. I saw my father's health decline as his empire hollowed, and I saw my mother double down on denial, pretending the rot wasn't there. I wasn't the family failure anymore. I was the unseen observer, the one holding the map while they raced toward the edge. They didn't know it yet, but every insult, every laugh, every dismissive glance was data. Every slight was a lesson in control. They had raised me to survive their world. They just never expected me to rewrite it. The Callahan dining room had always felt more like a courtroom than a place for family meals. The mahogany table gleamed under soft chandelier light long enough to fit a jury, and that night I felt like the defendant once again. Margot sat at the head beside our father, radiant and confident, while our mother presided like a judge whose verdict was already decided. I'd been invited last minute, a gesture of civility before the company's big merger announcement. The smell of rosemary and expensive wine filled the air, masking the tension that pulsed beneath the silverware. "You know," Nora Margot began between sips of her Bordeaux, "it's funny how life turns out. You were always the dreamer, the idealist. I guess we both found what we were meant for, me running an empire and you advising small shops." A few polite laughs followed. I set down my fork. "Purpose tends to outlive prestige," I said quietly. The table went still for half a breath before Vivian broke into a delicate chuckle as if to smooth the discomfort. "Your sister's worked very hard, Nora. You could be proud of her instead of defensive." Defensive. That word hung heavy in the air like a verdict rendered without trial. I took a breath, forcing calm. "I am proud," I said. "I just hope the empire she's running has stronger foundations than it did a decade ago." Margot's eyes narrowed, her composure cracking for the first time. "Excuse me, debt ratios," I said evenly. "Supplier disputes. A few questionable offshore ventures. Nothing you'd call illegal, of course, but hardly sustainable." The color drained slightly from my father's face, though he stayed silent. Margot gave a tight laugh. "Always the analyst, Nora. Some of us create, others critique. And some," I said softly, "clean up what others break." Ethan, sitting 2 seats away as a guest of a board member, shot me a look, a warning wrapped in concern. I ignored it. Margot leaned forward, her voice sharp. "You think you know how to run a company? You couldn't even keep a job in one." I smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why I learned to own them instead." The silence that followed was thick and electric. Vivian gasped softly. Charles cleared his throat, the patriarch's signal to end a losing battle. "That's enough for tonight," he said, but the damage was done. Margot's jaw tightened. She hated losing control. I reached for my glass and lifted it slightly, my voice calm. "To family," I said again the same words I'd used at the gala, but this time there was weight behind them. "May we all learn what's worth keeping and what's worth letting go." I drank the crystal cool against my lips while Margot's reflection stared back at me in the polished silver. For the first time, she looked uncertain. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Later that night, the city outside my penthouse pulsed with a quiet rhythm, headlights cutting through rain, distant sirens echoing between towers. I sat by the window, laptop open, spreadsheets glowing in the dim light. On the screen were documents labeled in coded initials ADM47 CH Transfer RC Master File. Ethan Rowe's face flickered into view on the encrypted call, his expression composed but wary. "You sure you want to go through with this, Nora?" he asked. "They're your family." "They stopped being my family when they made me their punchline," I said, voice steady. "Now they're just a case study." He leaned back, arms crossed. "Aurum Dynamics is ready. But once this deal is signed, there's no undoing it." "Good," I said. "Let it stand." Aurum Dynamics was more than a tech company. It was the final thread in a web I'd been spinning for years. When Margot pushed Callahan and Hayes toward reckless expansion, she'd left behind dozens of minor acquisitions, the ones too small to matter to her. I bought them one by one under shell corporations, tiny, forgettable names, hiding a single pattern mine. Through Rowe and Callahan Holdings, I controlled enough of their suppliers, enough of their logistics chain, enough of their leverage. All I needed was the merger. Ethan's tone softened. "You've planned this for a long time." 10 years, I said. 10 years of being their ghost. On my screen, the structure of ownership unfolded like a quiet symphony of precision Aurum dynamics. At the top, Callahan and Hayes circling beneath it, like a planet about to lose its orbit. "Margot thinks Aurum is her savior," I continued. "She doesn't realize it's her leash." Ethan frowned. "You could have walked away, Nora. Started fresh." "Why this?" I looked out at the city, its lights shimmering like false promises. Because walking away never taught them anything. They built an empire on arrogance. I'm just teaching them what humility costs. A silence stretched between us, heavy but unspoken. Finally, he said, "Then I'll make sure the clause is watertight. No loopholes, no appeal. Make it beautiful," I replied. "I want the truth to be written in ink they can't erase." After the call ended, I sat alone listening to the hum of the rain against the glass. For years they had laughed my mother with her elegant cruelty, my father with his silence, Margot with her perfect teeth and poison tone. Every laugh had become fuel, every dismissal a map. They'd forgotten that I was raised by the same empire they worshipped. I knew how their world worked because I'd built part of it. Only now I was building something else. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark. In the reflection, I saw my face, calm, sharp, resolved. The family thought they'd buried me a decade ago. Tomorrow they'd realize I'd been planting roots instead. The morning of my father's birthday began with the sound of rain against the bay windows of the Callahan estate. The house smelled like cedar and old money, sharp, familiar, suffocating. I hadn't planned to come, but an invitation with my father's handwriting had arrived a week earlier. Dinner. Just family, it said. I told myself it was a chance to make peace, maybe to offer one last bridge before everything changed. But deep down, I already knew peace was never part of this family's vocabulary. Margot greeted me at the door, immaculate as ever. "You came," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How brave." "It's just dinner, Margot," I replied. "Not a duel. For you, everything's a duel," she whispered before turning away. Inside, my father sat near the fireplace, thinner than I remembered, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted a glass of scotch. My mother hovered beside him, still wrapped in pearls and control. "Nora," she said softly, "it's been too long. You look, well," the unspoken half of that sentence lingered. "You look like someone who doesn't belong here." I handed my father a thick envelope tied with a ribbon. "Happy birthday," I said. "It's a proposal, an idea for restructuring the company's debt. I thought maybe—" "We don't need your charity," Margot interrupted, her voice sharp as glass. She plucked the folder from his lap and flipped through the pages, her polished nails tapping. "This is amateur, a consultant's fantasy. How touching." I held her gaze. "It's math, Margot. It doesn't care about pride." "Neither do I," she snapped, and without hesitation she tore the document in half. The sound of paper ripping cut through the room like thunder. My father flinched. My mother looked away. "Enough," Charles said weakly, his authority a ghost of what it once was. "We don't need this tonight." My throat tightened, but my voice stayed calm. "You're right. You don't need it. But soon you'll wish you had read it." I turned to leave. Margot's laughter followed me down the hall, cold and victorious. "You always dramatize everything, Nora. The world doesn't revolve around your bruised ego." I stopped by the doorway and looked back at her. My reflection caught in the gold frame of one of her corporate awards. "No," I said softly. "It revolves around balance. You might want to learn that word." Outside, the rain had turned heavier, washing over the marble steps like tears no one in that house would ever shed. My hands trembled slightly as I slid into the car, the hurt still fresh but burning into focus. I dialed Ethan. "Activate Project Orem," I said. "Phase 1 starts tonight." There was a pause on the line. "You're sure?" he asked. I looked at the house through the fogged window, its glowing chandeliers a beacon of everything shallow I had left behind. Completely. When I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not satisfaction, but clarity. For years, I'd been trying to earn a place at their table. Now I realized I was meant to build my own, and this time it wouldn't be made of glass. By day, I was still the daughter they mocked, the quiet disappointment who wore simple clothes, drove herself to meetings, and stayed invisible. But by night, I was the architect of something far larger than any of them imagined. From the top floor of my Manhattan office, I watched the skyline burn gold with the setting sun. Below me, the city hummed like a machine I had learned to master. Ethan stood beside me, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired from another sleepless night. Orem's board approved the merger terms, he said. Margot's team thinks they're getting the better deal. They have no idea who's sitting on the other side. I smiled faintly. That's the beauty of arrogance, it blinds them to the fine print. On the table between us lay a folder labeled Aurum Dynamics, Governance Clause 47C. It was my masterpiece, a single paragraph buried in legal text that ensured if Callahan and Hayes defaulted on its post-merger obligations, full operational control would automatically transfer to Rowe and Callahan Holdings. Not Aurum. Not Margot. Me. Ethan studied my face for a moment. You've built an empire of shadows, Nora. Nobody knows it's you. Not the investors, not the regulators, not even your family. Doesn't that ever bother you? I looked out over the city. They taught me that visibility is a trap. Power doesn't come from being seen. It comes from being inevitable. He nodded slowly. And when the truth comes out, then they'll understand that I didn't disappear. I just stopped performing. My assistant, Lydia Chin, entered quietly, her black heels clicking softly against the marble. Ms. Callahan, the lawyers, finalized the secondary contracts. Graham Pierce is ready for signature. Perfect, I said. Send the final draft to my private account. No leaks. Lydia hesitated. You really want to go through with this? Yes, I said, my tone even. Margot built her empire on borrowed power. I'm just calling in the debt. When they left the room, I stayed by the window watching the reflection of my own face in the glass. It was strange how calm I looked. 10 years ago, that face would have trembled, desperate for their approval. Now it was a mask carved from patience. My phone buzzed. A message from Graham. Looking forward to meeting your sister tomorrow. She's sharp. Overconfident but sharp. I typed back. That's her favorite combination. Then I locked the screen and let the city lights blur. I thought of my father's quiet disappointment, my mother's cutting words, Margot's laughter that always sounded like victory. They believed silence meant surrender. They never realized silence was the sound of strategy. Tomorrow Margot would walk into a deal she thought she owned. But in the world I'd built, ownership had a new definition, and every letter of it belonged to me. The following weeks unfolded like a flawless game of chess. Every move Margot made had already been anticipated, mapped, and quietly redirected. Aurum Dynamics. The shining new partner she'd bragged about at every cocktail event was already woven into my web through holding companies she didn't know existed. She believed the merger would save Callahan and Hayes from its mounting debts, but in truth, the company had already been swallowed whole. Ethan and I sat in our Manhattan conference room late one night, the skyline glowing like molten steel beyond the glass. Clause 47C is buried deep, he said, sliding the legal draft toward me. Even the most diligent counsel won't notice it. Lydia triple-checked every reference point. I scanned the final version. Good. By the time they do, it'll already be too late. You realize, Ethan said, leaning back, this isn't just a corporate takeover. This is dismantling a dynasty. No, I corrected. It's rescuing a legacy from the people who destroyed it. Margot's arrogance had blinded her. She was obsessed with maintaining the illusion of power appearances, parties' interviews. She didn't see the cracks beneath her own foundation. I saw them all, and now I would use them. 3 days later, Aurum's representatives, my people, met with Margot's executive board in Boston. I didn't attend in person. I didn't need to. My presence was there in every line of that contract, every signature waiting to lock them into their own undoing. From my office, I watched the news coverage live. Callahan and Hayes to merge with Aurum Dynamics in historic deal, the headline read. Cameras flashed as Margot smiled at the podium, her tone syrupy with triumph. Today marks a new chapter for our family legacy, she said proudly. Callahan and Hayes is stronger than ever. I muted the television, watching her expression freeze mid-sentence. You're right, I murmured. It is a new chapter. Just not the one you think. Ethan entered with a fresh cup of coffee. The contracts are signed, he said. Congratulations, Ms. Callahan. Don't congratulate me yet, I replied. Wait 90 days. He smirked. And when the debt clauses activate, then the empire she inherited becomes the empire I built. The following weeks passed quietly. The media celebrated Margot as the savior of the Callahan name. My mother sent out statements to the press, my father avoided interviews, and the family portrait hung in every article, a frozen illusion of unity. Meanwhile, inside the company, cracks deepened. Margot had overextended funneling resources into public image campaigns while neglecting financial stability. And every missed payment, every delayed audit triggered Clause 47C inch by inch. The trap wasn't cruel, it was clinical, elegant, legal. Ethan called it a symphony of consequences. Lydia called it justice written in corporate language. I called it balance. On the 87th day, the audit report landed on Margot's desk, cash flow deficit breach of covenant automatic governance transfer. It was over. They'll try to challenge it, Ethan said that morning, sliding me the summary. But it's airtight. I nodded, staring at the Callahan Tower outside the window. Let them try. The law doesn't bend for pride. That night, as I packed my notes for the upcoming board presentation, Ethan paused at the door. Do you ever wonder how it'll feel the moment they realize who took everything they mocked? I thought for a long moment, then said softly, like silence finally being heard. He smiled faintly, nodding once before leaving me alone in the dim light. I looked down at the contract on my desk, the same one Margot had signed with her diamond pen, the same ink that would undo her tomorrow. Power, I realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered through paper and clauses through patience and precision, and by the time anyone noticed the sound, it was already too late. The morning of the signing ceremony dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline Boston day that made the city's skyline look carved from glass. From the top floor of Callahan Plaza, I could see everything the harbor gleaming in winter light, the streets below humming with movement, the banners fluttering proudly, a new era for Callahan and Hayes. Margot's name was printed beneath the slogan bold and shining. It was almost poetic. Inside the boardroom smelled of polish and nerves. Executives in tailored suits murmured quietly, papers shuffled and cameras clicked. Margot stood at the head of the long marble table, perfect as always, pearls at her throat, her voice smooth as silk. Let's make history, gentlemen. Beside her sat my parents. My mother's smile was tight but radiant. My father's expression blank, the same mask he wore when pretending not to see. I waited outside the glass doors until the clock hit 9. Then Ethan opened them for me. The room stilled. Margot's pen froze mid-signature. Good morning, I said, walking in my heels, clicking softly against the marble. Apologies for the delay. A few of the directors exchanged confused glances. And you are one of them? Asked, flipping through the agenda. The consultant Margot said, recovering quickly. My sister, don't worry, she won't take long. Actually, I said, setting my briefcase on the table, I will. Because this meeting concerns Rowe and Callahan Holdings. The projector screen behind me flickered to life, displaying the Aurum Dynamics logo, followed by a cascade of subsidiary names, all tracing back to one entity, Rowe and Callahan Holdings. My name appeared beneath it in clean black type. Nora Callahan, I said. Founder and CEO. The silence that followed felt electric, the kind that only breaks when disbelief collapses into comprehension. Margot's face drained of color. You're lying. Am I? I pressed a button on the remote, and the next slide appeared a flowchart of ownership transfers, contracts, and signatures. Clause 47C. Signed by you, witnessed by your legal team, and filed under the Aurum Agreement. Upon default of the post-merger payment schedule, control transfers to Rowe and Callahan Holdings. That would be me. My father rose slowly, his voice shaking. Nora, this isn't necessary. I looked at him, feeling a faint ache where love used to be. Neither was their mockery, father. But here we are. Margot slammed her pen on the table. You manipulated this entire deal, I fulfilled it. I replied calmly. You didn't read the contract you were so proud of signing. You were too busy rehearsing for interviews. My mother's hand trembled against her pearls. You're destroying your own family, she whispered. I met her gaze. No, Mother. I'm exposing what it already became. Ethan handed out the final legal packet to each director. Every page bore official seals and signatures airtight and undeniable. The oldest board member cleared his throat. Clause 47C is valid, he said reluctantly. The transfer is automatic. Margot turned to him, desperation edging her voice. You can't possibly enforce this. It's not a matter of choice, he said quietly. It's the law. Margot's lips parted, but no words came. Her composure cracked just a flicker, but enough to reveal the truth beneath the armor. She looked smaller suddenly, like a queen who had discovered her throne was paper. I stepped to the head of the table and took the seat she'd just vacated. Effective immediately, I said, Rowe and Callahan assumes full operational control of Callahan and Hayes Holdings. New management structure will be communicated within 24 hours. The words came out steady, precise, final. My father sank back into his chair. My mother's eyes glistened not from anger this time, but from something closer to recognition. I signed the final document, my name flowing beneath the letterhead like a quiet storm. Nora Callahan, CEO. For a long moment, no one moved. Then I rose, gathering my papers. You know, I said softly, looking at Margot for years, you told me I didn't understand business. You were right. I didn't understand yours, but I learned my own. She looked at me, then eyes, wet fury and disbelief tangled together. Was it worth it? She asked hoarsely. I met her gaze. Every lesson costs something, Margot. I just stopped paying with my dignity. I walked to the glass wall, the city sprawling beneath us like an empire reborn. Behind me, I heard Ethan clear his throat. Meeting adjourned. The doors shut softly as we left the sound of silence closing around them. Outside, the wind was cold and sharp. It smelled like steel and rain and freedom. I pulled my coat tighter, my reflection glinting faintly in the mirrored surface of the building. For the first time in years, I looked exactly like who I was meant to be. The news broke within hours. Every financial network from Boston to London ran the same headline. Rowe and Callahan Holdings acquires Callahan and Hayes in historic transfer of control. Beneath it was a photo of Margot at the signing table, smiling proudly beside the very document that had undone her. By noon, her phone was ringing off the hook. Investors, journalists, lawyers. Every call began with the same question, is it true? By sunset, the answer was yes. I watched from my office as the story spread the city, humming beneath me. Ethan leaned against the window, arms crossed. You did it, he said quietly. You actually did it. No, I corrected. I revealed it. Because this was never about taking something that wasn't mine. It was about reclaiming what they buried. Down in Callahan Plaza, chaos was blooming. Employees gathered in huddles, executives rushed between meetings, and security escorted a screaming Margot out of the building she had once ruled like a queen. Cameras flashed as she pushed through the crowd, makeup-streaked composure gone. This isn't over, she shouted to a reporter, her voice raw. But it was. The board had already voted to ratify the transfer. Every document bore her signature. Every clause had been executed cleanly. That night she came to me. The elevator doors opened in my private lobby, and there she was. No makeup, no armor. Just the faint tremor of someone who had finally run out of control. You always wanted this, she said as she stepped inside. Don't pretend otherwise. I wanted justice, I replied. This is just the price of it. Her laugh was bitter. Justice? You humiliated our family. You've destroyed everything we built. I turned to face her fully. You destroyed it when you decided success mattered more than integrity. You made the company a mirror of yourself, beautiful, brittle, and hollow. She looked around the office at the clean lines and glass at the name Rowe and Callahan etched in silver on the wall. You think this makes you better than me? No, I said softly. It makes me free. For the first time, Margot's mask cracked completely. Her eyes welled. I did everything they asked, she whispered. I became who they wanted. I was perfect. And it killed you, I said gently. They taught us to worship the family name. You just never realized it was a cage. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city lights glimmered like distant fireflies beyond the window. Then she exhaled a sound between defeat and release. You win, she murmured. You always were the smarter one. This was never a competition, I said. It was survival. She turned to leave, but paused by the door. What happens now? Now, I said, you learn what it feels like to start over without a safety net. Maybe that's how we both find out who we really are. Her hand trembled as she pressed the elevator button. For a brief second, her reflection met mine in the mirrored wall. two sisters raised under the same roof shaped by the same silence now standing on opposite sides of it. When the doors closed, I stood alone. Later that evening, I watched the Callahan and Hayes sign being taken down from the plaza facade. The metal letters clattered against the pavement below, a sound that felt like an ending. Workers replaced it with a new one, Rowe and Callahan Holdings. It gleamed under the floodlights, sharp and unapologetic. Ethan joined me on the terrace, hands in his pockets. "Does it feel how you thought it would?" he asked. I thought of Margot's eyes, of my father's silence, of my mother's pearls trembling in her hands. I thought of every dinner where laughter had come at my expense, every time I'd swallowed humiliation like medicine. "No," I said finally. "It feels heavier." He nodded slowly. "You carried this for a long time." "I had to," I said. "Someone had to." The next morning, the papers called me the quiet heir. Some framed it as triumph, others as betrayal. But the truth sat somewhere in between. It wasn't victory or vengeance, it was equilibrium. For the first time in my life, the balance sheet finally made sense. And yet, as I stared at the photo of Margot walking out of the building, her head bowed against the flashes, I felt no thrill, no pride. Only the quiet ache that comes when justice is done, but the cost still echoes. In the stillness of my office, I whispered to no one in particular. "May we both find peace in what's left." Outside, the last piece of the old sign was lifted away, leaving a faint shadow where the family name had been, a perfect outline of everything we lost and everything I'd reclaimed. The silence after victory was never as sweet as people imagined. It wasn't champagne and applause, it was the sound of absence. In the weeks following the takeover, the Callahan name became a whisper in business circles. Investors withdrew, board members resigned quietly, and what had once been a dynasty turned into a cautionary tale. My phone buzzed constantly with requests for interviews, invitations to panels, headlines calling me the woman who outsmarted her own family. I turned them all down. I hadn't done this to be famous. Fame was Margot's addiction, not mine. The only calls I answered were from Ethan and Lydia tying up the final legal transfers that sealed the company under Rowe and Callahan Holdings. "It's done," Ethan said one morning, sliding the last folder across my desk. "They can't undo any of it." "Good," I replied, though the word felt heavier than triumph should. The window behind me reflected the city's winter light, cold and unforgiving. My father called 3 days later. His voice was smaller, slower. "Nora," he began, "you've proven your point." I almost laughed. "This wasn't about proving a point, Dad." "Then what was it?" he asked. "Retribution." "No," I said. "Redemption." There was a pause. "You've hurt your sister. Your mother hasn't left her room in days." I closed my eyes. "I didn't hurt them, Dad." The truth did. He exhaled softly, an old man's sigh, full of things unsaid. "You're still my daughter," he murmured, "even if I don't recognize what you've become." "Maybe that's the problem," I said quietly. "You never really tried to." The line went silent before disconnecting. A few days later, a letter arrived, not typed but handwritten, shaky but unmistakable. It was from my mother. "We raised you to chase status, not substance. Margot learned the wrong lesson and we never stopped her. You learned the right one and we punished you for it. I'm sorry." There was no signature at the end, only the faint imprint of perfume I'd known since childhood. I sat for a long time, holding the letter between my fingers, the paper trembling, though my hands did not. Forgiveness didn't come easy, but it came quietly. Not as absolution, but as understanding. They had built their lives on appearances, and I had built mine on the ruins. Neither of us had truly lived until now. A week later, Margot's townhouse went on the market. Rumor had it she'd moved upstate alone. She didn't answer my messages. I didn't blame her. Some wounds take silence to heal. I still went to the office every day, but it felt different now, emptier somehow. The goal that had kept me alive for 10 years was gone. The war was over, but victory had a strange loneliness to it. Ethan stopped by one evening with coffee. "You should go home," he said. "Rest." I looked around at the glass walls, the city outside flickering like a heartbeat. "I am home," I said, though even I didn't believe it. When he left, I stood by the window watching snow drift over the plaza where the old family logo had been torn down. The wind howled faintly against the glass, and for a moment, I saw my reflection superimposed over the city, the woman they'd underestimated, the one who had rewritten the story they thought they owned. It wasn't pride that filled me. It was closure. The Callahan name still existed, but now it belonged to something honest, something earned, something finally mine. A year passed before I realized I had stopped looking over my shoulder. The headlines had faded, the interviews had ended, and Rowe and Callahan Holdings had evolved into something far greater than the revenge that birthed it. We rebuilt Callahan and Hayes from the ground up, not as a monument to ego, but as a model of ethical strategy. Departments once ruled by nepotism became led by merit. The employees who had spent years overlooked found themselves promoted, listened to, respected, and slowly the company that once mocked integrity became defined by it. I still came into the office early each morning, the habit of a decade's worth of preparation. But instead of the hunger that once drove me, there was calm. Ethan noticed it too. "You don't look like you're carrying the world anymore," he said one afternoon, leaning against my doorway. "That's because I finally put it down," I replied, signing a document that approved a new initiative, the Callahan Foundation. The foundation's mission was simple: empower women who had been silenced, underestimated, or dismissed. We funded scholarships, small businesses, mentorship programs. When the board questioned the name, I smiled. "Because I want it to stand for something different now," I said. "Something cleaner." That evening, I walked through the quiet halls of our headquarters. The name Rowe and Callahan glowed faintly in silver above the main entrance. Below it hung a framed quote from one of our first employee workshops: "Power doesn't corrupt. People do." It made me stop. Once I'd believed power itself was the poison that ruined my family. But now I knew better. Power had only revealed who they were. Ethan joined me on this terrace as the sunset melted across the skyline. "You ever think about seeing them?" he asked gently. "I do," I said. "Sometimes I think about calling my mother visiting my father, but some goodbyes don't need words." "And Margot." I hesitated, the cool wind brushing against my hair. "She's living quietly," I said. "I heard she volunteers at a community center. Maybe that's her version of starting over." Ethan studied me. "And yours?" I smiled faintly. "Mine's letting go." We stood there for a while, the city humming below us, neither of us needing to fill the silence. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like distance. It felt like peace. When I finally turned to leave, I paused at the door, looking back one last time. The office lights shimmered across the marble floor, and for a brief moment, I imagined the girl I once was, the one who'd stood at those family dinners, small and invisible, clutching her worth like something fragile. She smiled at me through memory, steady and unafraid. "You did it," she seemed to whisper. I walked out into the night, the sound of my heels echoing down the corridor, soft and certain. The city outside glowed with the kind of light that comes after a storm, not blinding, not loud, just honest. Justice didn't roar. It never needed to. It simply arrived calm and absolute, and then it stayed. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I replay the beginning, the laughter at the gala. Margot's cutting words, my mother's quiet dismissal. I remember standing there feeling small under crystal chandeliers, surrounded by people who mistook cruelty for class. I can still hear Margot's voice saying, "Still helping small businesses stay small." She thought she was being clever. In truth, she was predicting her own downfall. But I don't think about revenge anymore. The hunger that once burned in me has turned into something quieter, something cleaner. Because in the end, it wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about proving myself right. I speak at universities sometimes to young women who ask how I survived being underestimated. I tell them this: you don't need loud validation to make your work meaningful. Let them laugh. Let them talk. Then build anyway. I see their faces light up the same way mine once did before the world taught me to dim it. And I realize that's what all of this was for. Not the empire, not the legacy, but the permission to be whole without their approval. One night, after an event, I walked past the old Callahan Plaza. The building had a new name, now ours, but the foundation stones were still the same. I could see my reflection in the glass doors, older, steadier, a little softer. For a moment, I thought I saw my mother beside me, pearls glinting faintly. Her eyes not judgmental this time, but wistful. I imagined her saying, "You changed the meaning of our name." Maybe I did. I looked up at the skyline at the thousands of lights burning quietly in office towers across the city and smiled. "They told me I was naive," I said softly to the night. "They told me I was small, but I learned something they never did. Power doesn't need to be loud to be real." Somewhere, a gust of wind brushed past, scattering the last leaves of winter across the pavement. The city kept moving. The world kept spinning. And I, for the first time, wasn't chasing anything. I'd already built it. So I whispered the words that had carried me through every setback, every laugh, every silent room that thought I didn't belong. Words I hope someone else remembers one day when they're standing alone, doubted but unbroken. "Success doesn't have to look how they expect," I said. "It just has to be yours."